There is a specific mechanism that has kept the US dollar at the center of global finance for 50 years. Not military power, not economic output, not institutional trust. A mechanism, a closed loop of transactions, obligations, and structural incentives that generated mandatory demand for American paper from every nation on earth that needed to power its factories, fuel its vehicles, and run its military. That mechanism was called the petrodollar. And on June 9, 2024, Saudi Arabia declined to renew it. The agreement expired quietly. No press conference, no formal announcement, no front-page coverage in the financial press. The most consequential monetary decision since Nixon closed the gold window in August 1971 was reported in a footnote in a Bloomberg terminal note, noted by a handful of macro analysts and ignored by virtually every financial media outlet that spent the same week running segments on the Fed's dot plot and the latest inflation print. Now, 8 months after that expiration, the Strait of Hormuz is closed. Iran has activated a yuan-denominated energy corridor through the world's most critical oil choke point. China's payment infrastructure is settling energy trades that used to require dollars. And the dollar index, the DXY, has fallen below 100 and continues weakening at a moment when, by every historical precedent, a global energy crisis and a Middle East war should be driving it sharply higher. That inversion, a dollar falling when it should be rising, a petrodollar system collapsing exactly when its absence is most visible, is not a coincidence. It is the mechanism breaking down. And I want to walk you through exactly how that mechanism worked, exactly why it is now breaking, and exactly what the data tells us about where this leads for every dollar-denominated asset you hold right now. Let me start with the mechanism, because until you understand it precisely, nothing that follows will be fully legible. The petrodollar system was designed in 1974 by US Treasury Secretary William Simon and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger following two specific crises. The first was Nixon's 1971 closure of the gold window, which ended the Bretton Woods system and left the dollar without its foundational anchor. The second was the 1973 OPEC oil embargo, which demonstrated that the Gulf producers had the capacity to destabilize the entire Western economy through energy policy. The deal struck with Saudi Arabia in June 1974 resolved both crises simultaneously with a single arrangement. Saudi Arabia would price all oil sales in US dollars exclusively. All other OPEC members would follow. In exchange, the United States would provide military security guarantees to the Saudi regime, sell advanced weapons to the Saudi armed forces, and guarantee the physical protection of the Arabian Peninsula. The effect was immediate and structural. Every nation that imported oil, which by 1974 meant essentially every industrialized economy on the planet, suddenly needed US dollars as a prerequisite for energy access, not as an investment, not as a store of value, as a toll. You could not buy oil without first acquiring dollars, and you could not run a modern economy without buying oil. Therefore, demand for dollars was not discretionary, it was mandatory, built into the basic operating requirements of every government, every central bank, every economy that consumed energy. This mandatory demand was the structural floor that prevented the dollar from collapsing after the Bretton Woods breakdown, and it had a second layer that made the system even more self-reinforcing. When Saudi Arabia and the Gulf producers accumulated billions of dollars from oil sales, those petrodollars needed to be invested somewhere. The obvious destination, the most liquid, most creditworthy, most dollar-denominated asset in the world, was US Treasury bonds. Petrodollars flowed into treasuries. Treasury demand kept US borrowing costs lower than they would otherwise be. Lower borrowing costs allowed the US government to spend beyond its means to run fiscal deficits that would have triggered currency crises in any other country because the petrodollar recycling mechanism was continuously backstopping demand for American government debt. The closed loop looked like this. America imported oil. Oil producers sold in dollars. Dollar revenue went into US Treasuries. Treasury demand suppressed US yields. Suppressed yields allowed US fiscal deficits. Deficits financed American consumption. American consumption created demand for more oil, and the cycle repeated for 50 years without interruption. Understanding this loop is essential because what is happening right now is not that the loop is slowing down. The loop is being bypassed, and the data is documenting that bypass in real time. Let me give you the specific numbers because the specifics matter more than any framing. China's cross-border interbank payment system, known as CIPS, processed approximately 175 trillion yuan in 2024, equivalent to roughly 24.5 trillion at current exchange rates. That is a 43% increase year over year. For context, CIPS processed approximately 14 trillion in 2022. In 2 years, the transaction volume of China's alternative to SWIFT and the dollar settlement system increased by $10 trillion annually. The plumbing for a non-dollar energy trade was not theoretical. As of February 2026, when Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, it was operational, scaled, and growing at 43% per year. China's official US Treasury holdings have fallen to $682.6 billion as of late 2025, the lowest level since 2008. The peak was approximately $1.3 trillion in 2013. Over 12 years, China reduced its US Treasury exposure by more than half. Not in a panic, not as a political statement. As a systematic, multi-year strategic reallocation that accelerated after the Russian reserve freeze of 2022 demonstrated that dollar assets held in Western custody could be confiscated by executive order. The People's Bank of China added gold to its reserves for 15 consecutive months through January 2026, even as gold prices rose above $4,000, $5,000 per ounce, making each addition more expensive than the last. China's gold reserves as a percentage of total reserves reached their highest level since 2015. The Saudi Central Bank, the institution that was the primary counterparty to the original 1974 Petrodollar agreement, has been in active discussions with China's central bank about expanding yuan settlement capacity for oil trades. The non-renewal of the Petrodollar agreement in June 2024 did not happen in isolation. It happened at the conclusion of a decade of preparation, infrastructure building, and strategic realignment that has created, for the first time since 1974, a functional alternative to the mandatory dollar oil settlement system. Now I want to explain exactly what the Strait of Hormuz closure has done to this transition, because this is the part that most financial analysis has failed to connect clearly. The Hormuz closure is not a temporary disruption to an otherwise stable petrodollar system. It is the activation event for an alternative that was built specifically in anticipation of this kind of disruption. Here is the mechanism step by step. On February 28, 2026, Operation Epic Fury begins. U.S. and Israeli strikes hit Iran. Iran's Revolutionary Guard announces the closure of the Strait of Hormuz to Western-linked shipping. 20% of global daily oil supply is suddenly blocked. Over 100 tankers halt. 2 ships are attacked. Oil moves from $75 to above $100 per barrel within days. Energy importing nations, Turkey, India, Japan, South Korea, need to source oil immediately or face economic crisis. The alternative routes through Saudi pipelines and UAE bypass infrastructure have limited capacity and significant additional cost. And then the Iranian offer arrives. For buyers willing to settle in yuan through CIPS, arrangements can be made for Hormuz passage. The yuan-denominated oil corridor is not a future scenario. It is the operational solution to an immediate crisis for energy importing Asian economies that cannot afford to wait for diplomatic resolution. For Japan, for South Korea, for India, for every Asian economy that imports energy through Hormuz, the question in March 2026 is not ideological. It is practical. Do you pay more and wait longer for oil settled in dollars through alternative routes? Or do you use CIPS, settle in yuan, and access the corridor that Iran is offering? The answer is different for different nations. But the fact that the question is being asked at all, the fact that a yuan settlement alternative exists, is operational, and is being actively offered as the solution to a real energy crisis, represents a structural rupture in the petrodollar mechanism that would have been impossible before CIPS reached its current scale. Deutsche Bank analysts described this moment precisely in a March 2026 research note. The Iran conflict, they wrote, could be remembered as the key catalyst for erosion in petrodollar dominance and the beginning of what they called the petroyuan. This is not retail analysis, Deutsche Bank is the institution that manages more than 2 trillion euros in assets. When their macro research department uses the word petroyuan to describe what is emerging from the Hormuz corridor, they are making a structural call, not a geopolitical prediction. Now let me turn to what the market data is telling us about the implications of this transition, because the price action is speaking very clearly to anyone who knows what to listen for. The dollar index, the DXY, has fallen below 100 as of April 2026. In any normal geopolitical crisis scenario, a Middle East war, oil above $100, global risk aversion, the dollar should be strengthening. Safe haven demand for dollar assets should be driving the DXY toward 105 or higher. That is what history says should happen. The fact that the dollar is falling in precisely the conditions where it historically rises is a market signal of significant weight. It suggests that the safe haven premium of the dollar, the automatic demand for dollars during global crises that the petrodollar system generated and reinforced, is eroding. Investors are not reflexively fleeing to the dollar when the world gets more dangerous. They are looking for alternatives. And the alternatives they are finding are not the euro or the yuan, not yet at reserve currency scale. They are gold and commodity-linked assets that do not depend on any single government's credibility. Gold is at $4,161 per ounce as of April 14, 2026, down from its all-time high of $5,195 on January 29, 2026. That 19% correction has been read by most retail investors as a failed trade. The gold bull case was supposed to be validated by the Iran war. The Iran war happened. Gold fell. Therefore, the thesis was wrong. That reading, intuitive as it is, misses what the institutional data is saying. JP Morgan has maintained its 2026 year-end target of $6,300 per ounce through the entire March correction. Goldman Sachs has maintained $5,400. Deutsche Bank has maintained $6,000. None of these institutions has revised their targets downward. All of them have access to the same price data that retail investors are watching. None of them have concluded that the structural case for gold has changed because the paper price corrected 19% in a month. The reason is that they understand the difference between the paper price and the structural price. The paper price is set by the dollar, by bond yields, by algorithmic trading systems that sell gold when the DXY rises above 99 and when the 10-year Treasury yield rises above 4%. The structural price is set by the petrodollar non-renewal, by the petroyuan corridor, by 863 tons of central bank gold purchases in 2025, by $682 billion in Chinese Treasury selling, by the CIPS volume data, by the 43-year-old monetary structure that is being systematically dismantled and replaced in real time. The paper price and the structural price are currently separated by a gap that JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and Deutsche Bank have all independently calculated and published. They do not agree on the exact number. They agree that the gap is large and that it resolves upward. Let me be specific about the two indicators that tell you when the structural price reasserts itself over the paper price, because this is where the actionable insight sits. The first indicator is the DXY, the dollar index, currently below 100. When this index falls below 97, the primary mechanical suppressor of gold prices, the stronger dollar reducing the dollar price of gold, reverses. The dollar falls below 97 when global energy buyers reduce their emergency dollar demand, which happens when alternative settlement systems absorb enough of the Hormuz disruption to normalize the dollar bid. The CIPS system, growing at 43% per year, is doing exactly that work. Every trillion yuan in additional CIPS volume is $1 trillion of reduced mandatory dollar demand. Every barrel of oil settled in yuan through the Hormuz corridor is a barrel that did not generate petrodollar recycling into US Treasuries. The structural erosion of the petrodollar mechanism is happening in the CIPS transaction data, in the Chinese Treasury holding data, and in the Saudi reserve management decisions in real time. The second indicator is the 10-year US Treasury yield, currently at approximately 4.25%. When this yield falls below 3.5%, the opportunity cost argument against holding gold, the argument that you can earn 4.25% risk-free in treasuries while gold pays nothing, collapses. The 10-year yield falls below 3.5% when the Federal Reserve is forced to cut rates. The Fed is forced to cut rates when the $9.2 trillion in federal debt that must be refinanced this fiscal year at 4+% rates generates interest costs that overwhelm the fiscal position. The United States is currently paying $1.03 trillion annually in interest on its debt, the first time in American history that interest payments have exceeded the entire defense budget. At 4.25% rates applied to $9.2 trillion in maturing debt, the arithmetic of sustained monetary restriction becomes fiscally impossible before the end of 2026. The Fed will be forced to choose between fighting inflation and avoiding a fiscal crisis more severe than the inflation it is trying to prevent. When it makes that choice, and the debt mathematics say it will make it sooner rather than later, the 10-year yield will fall, the dollar will weaken, and the three simultaneous headwinds currently suppressing gold in the paper market will reverse simultaneously. The reversal of those three headwinds, dollar weakening, yields falling, and forced institutional liquidations exhausted, will occur against the structural backdrop of the petrodollar ending, the petroyuan beginning, central banks buying gold at record levels, and institutional research targets of $5,400 to $6,300 that have not been revised downward through the most volatile correction in gold in 3 years. There are two types of investors watching this data right now. The first type sees gold at 4,761, down 19% from its high, and concludes the trade failed. They do not understand the petrodollar non-renewal of June 2024. They do not track CIPS volume data. They did not notice that Deutsche Bank used the word petroyuan in a March 2026 research note. They read the paper price and see a broken trade. The second type sees the same price and reads it differently. They see a paper market correction within a structural transition that is documented in the CIPS data, in the Chinese Treasury selling, in the Saudi Reserve management decisions, in the central bank gold purchase figures, and in the institutional targets of the research departments that manage more capital than any other entities on earth. They see the petrodollar ending and the petroyuan beginning and understand that this is not a geopolitical story or an energy story. It is the most consequential monetary story since Bretton Woods. And they understand that the assets that have preserved and generated wealth across every major monetary transition in the last 500 years, the assets without counterparty risk, without issuer risk, without the political liability that dollar assets now carry for every sovereign wealth fund that watched Russia's reserves get frozen in 2022, are the assets that central banks have been buying at record levels for 3 consecutive years. Watch the DXY, watch the 10-year yield, watch the CIPS volume data, watch the Saudi Reserve management reports, and understand that the mechanism that made the dollar mandatory for 50 years has ended. The question is not whether the transition is happening. The data has already answered that. The question is whether you understand it clearly enough and early enough to recognize what this transition means for every dollar-denominated asset, every treasury bond, every fixed income position, every retirement account denominated in the currency whose structural demand floor has just been removed. The petrodollar loop ran for 50 years. The loop is broken. What replaces it will be determined not by any single event, but by the same economic machine that has governed monetary history for 5 centuries. The machine does not stop, it shifts. And the investors who understand the shift before the consensus does are the ones who look back at April 2026, the way the investors who understood 1971 looked back at that August Sunday when Nixon went on television, not as the beginning of chaos, as the beginning of the most consequential wealth transfer of their generation.